Detective Sarah Martinez walked into the police station's break room, her gym bag slung over her shoulder. The morning shift was about to begin, but she had arrived early to grab coffee and mentally prepare for another day on the force. Her colleagues were already gathered around the coffee machine, their conversation flowing in the easy manner of people who had worked together for years. "Look who's here bright and early," called out Officer Rick Thompson, a veteran cop with 23 years on the force. His tone carried the familiar hint of mockery that Sarah had grown accustomed to over her 3 years in the department. "Let me guess, another intense workout session before work?" Sarah forced a smile as she poured her coffee. "Just trying to stay in shape, Rick. You know how it is." The truth was far more complicated, but she had learned that explanations often fell on deaf ears in this male-dominated environment. Right, Rick continued, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. "I'm sure those yoga classes and Pilates sessions are really preparing you for the streets. Real police work requires real strength, not fancy stretches." His smirk widened as a few other officers chuckled along. The comment stung more than Sarah. Let on. She had been dealing with these kinds of remarks since her first day at the precinct. Despite consistently proving herself capable in the field, some of her colleagues seemed determined to view her as the weak link. They questioned her physical abilities, her commitment, and her right to wear the badge with an authority she had earned through years of training and dedication. Officer Mike Chen, one of the few colleagues who had always treated her with respect, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Come on, Rick. Sarah's proven herself plenty of times. Remember the Henderson case last month?" His intervention was subtle but meaningful, a reminder that not everyone shared Rick's narrow perspective. Rick waved him off dismissively. "I'm just saying, when push comes to shove, you need officers who can handle themselves in real confrontations, not someone who spends more time at the gym than actually learning police work." His eyes remained fixed on Sarah, waiting for a reaction that would confirm his preconceptions about her supposed fragility. Sarah took a slow sip of her coffee, using the moment to compose herself. She had faced down armed suspects, chased criminals through dark alleys, and earned commendations for her work. Yet here she stood being questioned about her fitness for duty by someone who hadn't seen real action in years. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she had learned to pick her battles carefully. "Everyone has their own way of staying prepared," she replied evenly, refusing to take the bait. "What matters is being ready when duty calls." Her words were measured, professional, but beneath the surface, years of accumulated frustration simmered just below the boiling point. The room fell into an awkward silence as other officers sensed the tension. Some looked uncomfortable with Rick's behavior, while others seemed to be waiting for entertainment. Sarah recognized the dynamic all too well. It was a test, a challenge to see if she would lose her composure and give them ammunition to use against her later. As she prepared to leave for her patrol, Rick's voice followed her. "Just remember, Martinez, when things get tough out there, your yoga breathing exercises might not be enough. Real police work requires real toughness, not whatever they're teaching in those fitness classes of yours." His laughter echoed through the break room, a sound that would haunt her thoughts throughout the morning. Sarah paused at the doorway, her hand gripping the handle tighter than necessary. She turned back briefly, meeting Rick's gaze with steady eyes. "I think you'd be surprised what real toughness looks like, Rick, but hopefully you'll never have to find out." With that, she walked out, leaving behind a room full of confused expressions and unspoken questions. Little did Rick know that beneath Sarah's composed exterior lay a story of survival, sacrifice, and strength that would challenge everything he thought he knew about courage. The uniform she wore with such pride concealed scars both visible and invisible, testament to battles fought not in the line of duty, but in the struggle to simply exist in a world that had tried repeatedly to break her spirit. As Sarah began her patrol that morning, she carried with her not just the weight of her badge and responsibilities, but the burden of proving herself worthy of respect in an environment where judgment came swift and understanding came slowly. The day ahead would test not just her professional skills, but her ability to maintain dignity in the face of ignorance and prejudice that seemed as persistent as the morning fog rolling through the city streets. The morning patrol had been routine until the call came in. Sarah and her partner, Officer Davis, responded to a domestic disturbance on the east side of town. As they approached the rundown apartment building, the familiar knot in Sarah's stomach tightened. These calls were never simple, and they often triggered memories she preferred to keep buried. The apartment door hung slightly ajar, and angry voices echoed from within. Sarah's training kicked in as she and Davis positioned themselves on either side of the entrance. Through the gap, they could see a man towering over a woman who cowered near the kitchen counter, her face already showing the telltale marks of violence. "Please, just calm down." The woman's voice trembled. "The neighbors will call the police." "Let them come," the man roared back. "Nobody's going to tell me how to handle my own wife in my own home." His fist slammed against the counter, causing the woman to flinch and shrink further into herself. Sarah felt her jaw clench involuntarily. The scene before her was painfully familiar, though she was now on the other side of the intervention. Davis caught her eye and nodded toward the door. They had worked together long enough for him to recognize when Sarah became particularly focused during domestic calls. "Police, we're coming in," Davis announced as they entered the apartment. The man spun around, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. He was easily 6 feet tall, with the build of someone who used physical intimidation as his primary tool of control. "You have no right to be in my home," he snarled, stepping toward the officers with his chest puffed out. "This is a private matter between me and my wife." His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes as he sized up the two officers. "Sir, we need you to step back and calm down," Sarah said firmly, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even her. Something about the man's posture, his aggressive stance, and the fear in his wife's eyes had triggered a response deeper than her police training. "We've received reports of a disturbance, and we can see that someone here needs medical attention." The man's attention fixed on Sarah with a sneer. "Oh, great. They sent me the girl cop. What are you going to do? Arrest me?" He laughed mockingly and took another step forward. "I've been dealing with real men all my life, sweetheart. You don't scare me." Davis moved to intervene, but Sarah raised her hand slightly, a signal she had under control. Her years of experience had taught her that de-escalation often worked better than immediate aggression, especially when dealing with men who were already feeling challenged by a female officer's presence. "Nobody wants to arrest anyone today," Sarah replied calmly, though her muscles were coiled and ready for action. "We just want to make sure everyone is safe and get any medical help that might be needed." She gestured toward the woman, who was pressing a dish rag against her bleeding lip. "She's fine," the man spat. "She just needs to learn to keep her mouth shut when I'm talking. That's how marriage works. The man leads, the woman follows. Maybe if more cops understood that, we wouldn't have all these problems in society." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each syllable carrying the weight of memories she had spent years trying to overcome. Her breathing remained steady, but something shifted in her posture that Davis recognized immediately. He had seen this transformation before, usually right before Sarah displayed the kind of courage and determination that made her one of the most respected officers in their precinct. "Sir, I'm going to need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back," Sarah said, her voice now carrying a tone that brooked no argument. "You're under arrest for domestic violence and assault." "Like hell I am," the man roared, lunging toward her with surprising speed for someone his size. "I'm not going to be arrested by some little girl playing dress-up in a police uniform." What happened next would become the talk of the precinct for months to come. Sarah sidestepped the man's charge with fluid grace, using his momentum against him as she executed a perfect takedown that sent him crashing to the floor. In seconds, she had him face down with his arms secured behind his back, her knee positioned precisely to maintain control without causing unnecessary injury. Davis stood in amazement as Sarah calmly read the man his rights, her voice never wavering. Despite the adrenaline that must have been coursing through her system, the entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it had revealed a side of Sarah that few of her colleagues had ever witnessed. As backup arrived, and they prepared to transport the suspect, the man continued his verbal assault. "You think you're tough, but you're just another weak woman who needs a badge to feel strong. Real strength doesn't come from some academy training or fancy martial arts moves. Sarah paused in her paperwork, looking down at the man with an expression that mixed professional detachment with something deeper and more personal. "You're right about one thing," she said quietly. "Real strength doesn't come from training or techniques. It comes from surviving things that would break most people and still choosing to protect others." Her words carried a weight that silenced even the suspect's bitter complaints. Word of Sarah's skillful handling of the domestic disturbance spread quickly through the precinct, but it did little to change Rick Thompson's attitude. If anything, it seemed to intensify his need to diminish her accomplishments. During the afternoon briefing, he made sure to voice his opinions loud enough for everyone to hear. "So I hear Martinez had quite the morning," Rick announced as officers filed into the briefing room. "One lucky takedown and suddenly she's some kind of expert. I still say real police work requires more than fancy moves learned in a dojo somewhere." Sergeant Williams, a veteran supervisor with 15 years of experience, looked up from his paperwork with visible irritation. "Officer Thompson, Martinez handled that situation exactly by the book. The suspect was twice her size and completely out of control. Her actions probably prevented someone from getting seriously hurt." Rick shrugged dismissively. "I'm just saying, Williams, when you're facing real danger on the streets, you need officers with natural strength and instincts, not someone who has to rely on choreographed moves they learned in some weekend self-defense class." Sarah entered the briefing room just in time to hear Rick's comments. She took her usual seat near the back, choosing to ignore the stares and whispered conversations that followed her entrance. Officer Chen caught her eye and gave her an encouraging nod, but she could see that most of her colleagues were waiting to see how she would respond to Rick's latest provocation. The briefing proceeded with discussions of ongoing cases, patrol assignments, and department updates. Throughout the meeting, Rick continued to make subtle comments designed to undermine Sarah's credibility. He questioned her judgment on previous cases, suggested that her patrol assignments should be limited to safer areas, and repeatedly emphasized the need for officers who could handle real confrontations. After the briefing, Sarah found herself alone with Rick in the hallway. He had clearly been waiting for this opportunity to confront her directly, away from the watchful eyes of supervisors and more sympathetic colleagues. His expression carried the smug confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages in their ongoing conflict. "Look, Martinez," he began, his voice taking on a tone of false concern. "I don't have anything personal against you, but this job isn't a game. When your partner's life is on the line, they need to know they can count on real backup, not someone who learned how to fight from watching movies." Sarah turned to face him fully, her expression calm, but her eyes blazing with controlled intensity. "Rick, you've been questioning my abilities since the day I arrived here. You've criticized my training, my methods, my commitment, and my right to wear this badge. But you know what you've never done? You've never actually worked with me long, enough to see what I'm really capable of." "I've seen enough," Rick replied with a dismissive wave. "Today was just one incident. Real police work is about consistency, about being strong enough to handle whatever comes your way without breaking down. Some people are built for this job and some people aren't. It's nothing personal, just biology." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Rodriguez, the precinct commander who was known for his no-nonsense approach to both crime, fighting, and personnel management. He had been observing the interaction from down the hallway and decided it was time to intervene. "Thompson, Martinez, my office. Now." His voice carried the authority of someone who had seen every possible conflict between officers and knew exactly how to handle them. "We're going to settle this once and for all." In the captain's office, both officers stood at attention, while Rodriguez reviewed their files and recent performance reports. The silence stretched uncomfortably as he examined documentation that detailed every call they had responded to, every arrest they had made, and every commendation or complaint they had received. "Thompson," the captain began, "you've been on this force for 23 years. You've got a solid record, good arrest statistics, and you've trained a lot of new officers. But lately, I've been getting reports about your attitude toward Officer Martinez, and frankly, it's becoming a problem." Rick started to protest, but Rodriguez held up his hand for silence. "Martinez, you've been here 3 years. Your performance reviews are excellent. Your arrest rate is above average and you've received more citizen commendations than most officers see in their entire careers. You've also requested additional training more often than any other officer in this precinct." He leaned back in his chair, studying both officers carefully. "Now, I could lecture you both about teamwork and mutual respect, but I think the real issue here is that Thompson doesn't believe Martinez is tough enough for this job. Is that accurate, Thompson?" Rick nodded reluctantly. "Captain, with all due respect, this job requires physical and mental toughness that not everyone possesses. I'm concerned about officer safety when someone might not be able to handle extreme situations. And Martinez," the captain continued. "How do you respond to that concern?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her mind racing through possibilities. She could continue to argue her case based on performance metrics and training records, but she realized that Rick's skepticism went deeper than professional concerns. He needed to see proof of the kind of toughness that couldn't be measured in academy scores or arrest statistics. "Captain, Officer Thompson is right that this job requires a special kind of toughness," she said finally. "The kind that comes from facing your worst fears and finding the strength to keep going. The kind that develops when life teaches you that survival isn't guaranteed. It's earned every single day." Rodriguez nodded slowly, recognizing that there was more to this conversation than simple workplace friction. "I think it's time for some honest communication. Martinez, if you're comfortable with it, maybe it's time to help Thompson understand exactly what kind of toughness you bring to this job." Sarah looked between the two men, weighing her options. She had spent years protecting her privacy, keeping her personal history separate from her professional identity. But she realized that some battles couldn't be won with silence, and some truths needed to be spoken regardless of the cost. Sarah stared at the floor of Captain Rodriguez's office for what felt like an eternity. The weight of years of silence pressed down on her shoulders as she contemplated crossing a line she had never intended to cross. Her personal life had always been a fortress, protected by professional boundaries and careful deflection of curious questions. "You know what, Captain?" Sarah said finally, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "Maybe it is time for some honest communication." She looked directly at Rick, whose smug expression hadn't wavered. "Officer Thompson thinks he knows what real toughness looks like. He thinks it comes from size, from intimidation, from being the biggest person in the room." Rick shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the conversation was taking an unexpected turn. "Martinez, I never said anything about size. I just think this job requires certain qualities that not everyone possesses." "You're right," Sarah continued, ignoring his interruption. "This job does require certain qualities. It requires the ability to face violence without flinching. It requires mental strength that goes beyond anything they teach at the academy. It requires surviving things that would break most people and still showing up to protect others." She began unbuttoning her uniform shirt with deliberate, measured movements. Both men watched in confusion and growing discomfort as she revealed the plain white t-shirt underneath. Captain Rodriguez started to speak, but Sarah's raised hand silenced him. "You want to know about my workout story, Rick? You want to understand why I spend so much time in the gym, why I train so hard, why I push my body beyond what seems necessary?" Her voice carried an intensity that neither man had ever heard before. "Let me show you what real toughness looks like." Sarah pulled her t-shirt over her head, standing before them in her sports bra. What they saw rendered both men speechless. Her torso was a roadmap of survival, marked by scars that told a story of violence, recovery, and incredible determination. A long surgical scar ran along her left side, evidence of major internal repairs. Smaller scars dotted her shoulders and back, some clearly from defensive wounds, others from medical procedures. "This one," she said, pointing to a jagged scar near her collarbone, "is from a broken bottle. I was 17, living with my boyfriend who thought his fists were the solution to every disagreement. This one," she indicated a perfectly straight line across her ribs, "is from the surgery to repair the internal bleeding after he kicked me down a flight of stairs." Rick's face had gone pale, his earlier smugness replaced by shocked silence. Captain Rodriguez leaned forward in his chair, his professional demeanor giving way to genuine concern for one of his officers. Sarah continued her painful inventory. "These marks on my wrists aren't from handcuffs during training exercises. They're from being tied up for 3 days while he decided whether I was worth keeping alive. And this scar on my shoulder blade? That's from the knife he used to carve his initials into my back so I would never forget who I belonged to. The office fell into absolute silence. Outside, the normal sounds of the precinct continued. But inside this small space, two men were confronting a reality they had never imagined. Sarah's revelation had transformed her from a colleague they thought they knew into a survivor whose strength defied every assumption they had made. I didn't escape that situation because I was physically stronger than him, Sarah said, her voice never wavering despite the obvious emotional cost of sharing her story. I survived because I learned that true strength isn't about overpowering your opponent. It's about enduring pain that would kill most people and finding the will to keep fighting. Rick found his voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Martinez, I had no idea. Why didn't you ever say anything? Because it's not your business, Sarah replied matter-of-factly as she began to put her t-shirt back on. Because I didn't want to be seen as a victim. Because I earned my place here through merit, not sympathy. And because some people wouldn't understand that surviving something like that makes you stronger, not weaker. Captain Rodriguez cleared his throat, his own voice thick with emotion. How did you finally get away? Sarah's expression grew distant as she remembered those final terrifying hours. One night he came home drunk and angrier than I'd ever seen him. He had lost his job and somehow that was my fault too. He beat me unconscious and when I woke up I was in the hospital. A neighbor had finally called the police after hearing me scream. She finished buttoning her uniform shirt with hands that showed only the slightest tremor. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. Multiple internal injuries, 3 broken ribs, a collapsed lung, and severe trauma to my kidneys. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital and 6 months in physical therapy learning to walk normally again. Rick sat heavily in his chair, looking like a man who had just discovered that everything he thought he knew about the world was wrong. The gym, he said slowly. The training. It's not about staying in shape, is it? Every day I train is a promise I make to myself, Sarah confirmed. A promise that I will never again be helpless, that I will never again be at the mercy of someone who thinks violence makes them powerful. Every time I push my body beyond what seems possible, I'm proving that I survived for a reason. She straightened her uniform and looked at both men with an expression that combined vulnerability with unmistakable strength. So yes, Officer Thompson, I do know what real toughness looks like. I've lived it, survived it, and chosen to use it to protect others. The question is, now that you know the truth, do you finally understand what kind of officer you've been working with all along? The room remained silent as the full impact of Sarah's revelation settled over them like a heavy blanket, forever changing the dynamics of their professional relationship and their understanding of what it truly means to serve and protect. The silence in Captain Rodriguez's office stretched on for several minutes after Sarah finished speaking. Rick Thompson sat slumped in his chair, staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. The weight of his months of mockery and dismissive comments seemed to press down on his shoulders with crushing force. Every joke about her gym routines, every question about her toughness, every smirk and snide comment now felt like stones he had thrown at someone who was already carrying an unbearable burden. Captain Rodriguez was the first to break the silence. Martinez, I want you to know that sharing this took incredible courage. I also want you to know that if you ever need support services or time off, the department has resources available. His voice carried the gentle tone of someone who understood that trauma doesn't disappear just because someone becomes strong enough to function despite it. Sarah shook her head firmly. Thank you, Captain, but I didn't tell you this story because I need help. I told it because some people need to understand that strength comes in different forms. I'm not broken, I'm not fragile, and I don't need to be handled with kid gloves. I'm a police officer who happens to have survived something terrible and used that experience to become better at protecting others. Rick finally looked up, his face showing a mixture of shame and newfound respect. Sarah, I owe you an apology that goes way beyond anything I can put into words. I've been acting like a complete fool, and worse than that, I've been disrespecting someone who deserves nothing but admiration. Rick, you don't need to, Sarah began, but he held up his hand. No, please let me say this. I've been on this force for over 2 decades, and I thought I understood what it meant to be tough. I thought toughness was about physical size and intimidation, and never showing weakness. But what you've shown me today is that real toughness is about surviving hell and still choosing to serve others. It's about taking your worst experiences and using them to become stronger rather than bitter. Sarah studied his face carefully, looking for signs of the patronizing sympathy she had learned to despise. Instead, she saw something she hadn't expected: genuine humility and a dawning understanding of what she had accomplished simply by showing up to work each day. The thing is, Rick continued, I've never faced anything like what you survived. My biggest challenges have been dealing with difficult suspects and managing the stress of this job. I've never had to rebuild my entire life from scratch or find the courage to trust people again after someone tried to destroy me. Captain Rodriguez nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of perspective we need more of in this department. Officer Martinez, your experience gives you insights into domestic violence cases that most of us simply can't match. Your ability to connect with victims and de-escalate dangerous situations isn't just the result of good training. It's the result of lived experience. Sarah felt a strange mixture of relief and vulnerability. For 3 years, she had carried the burden of proving herself worthy of respect without ever being able to explain why she pushed herself so hard or why certain cases affected her more deeply than others. Now, with her story finally in the open, she felt both exposed and oddly liberated. The hardest part, she said quietly, wasn't surviving the physical abuse. It was learning to trust my own judgment again. When someone spends months convincing you that you're worthless, that you deserve whatever happens to you, that no one would ever believe your story over theirs, it takes years to rebuild that confidence. Rick winced visibly. And here I've been, questioning your judgment and abilities at every turn. God, Sarah, I must have sounded exactly like... He couldn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. That's why I never said anything before, she admitted. Because some people hear a story like mine and they see weakness instead of strength. They think surviving abuse makes you damaged rather than understanding that it makes you incredibly resilient. I needed to prove my capabilities first before anyone knew my history. The captain leaned back in his chair, processing everything he had learned about one of his officers. Martinez, I have to ask, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but is your abuser still out there? Is he still a threat? Sarah's expression hardened slightly. He died in prison 3 years ago. Drug overdose, according to the report I received. He was serving a 10-year sentence for what he did to me and for assaulting 2 other women after I left. Apparently, I wasn't his only victim. Rick shook his head in disbelief. How did you find the strength to become a police officer after going through something like that? Most people would be afraid to put themselves in dangerous situations again. Because I realized that my experience gave me a superpower, Sarah replied with a slight smile. I can spot predators from a mile away. I know how they think, how they operate, how they choose their victims. I can read body language and verbal cues that other officers might miss. My past doesn't make me weak. It makes me uniquely qualified to protect other people from going through what I survived. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the captain's door. Sergeant Williams poked his head in to report on the afternoon's activities, but he quickly sensed the emotional weight in the room and offered to come back later. Actually, Sergeant, come in, Captain Rodriguez said. I think it would be good for you to hear what we've been discussing. Officer Martinez has shared some important information that helps explain her exceptional performance in domestic violence situations. As the afternoon wore on, word began to spread through the precinct that something significant had happened in the captain's office. Officers noticed the change in Rick Thompson's demeanor immediately, his usual swagger replaced by a quiet thoughtfulness that made him seem like a different person entirely. Those who worked closely with Sarah detected a subtle shift in her energy as well, as if a weight she had been carrying for years had finally been lifted from her shoulders. The transformation was just beginning, but already the foundation had been laid for a new understanding of what it means to serve and protect, and what real courage looks like in the face of unimaginable adversity. 3 months after that transformative afternoon in Captain Rodriguez's office, The atmosphere at the precinct had undergone a remarkable change. Sarah Martinez walked through the hallways with a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from within, no longer burdened by the weight of secrets she had carried for so long. Her colleagues treated her with a respect that went beyond professional courtesy. They saw her now as someone who embodied the very essence of what it meant to protect and serve. Rick Thompson had become one of her most vocal supporters, though his transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the weeks following Sarah's revelation, he had struggled with feelings of shame and regret that sometimes seemed overwhelming. He began seeking out opportunities to work with her, initially as a form of penance, but gradually because he genuinely valued her insights and expertise. "Martinez, we've got another domestic call," he said one morning, approaching her desk with a case file in hand. "Repeat offender, history of escalation. I was hoping you might partner with me on this one." His tone carried none of the condescension that had once marked their interactions. Instead, there was a humble recognition of her unique qualifications for such cases. Sarah looked up from her paperwork, noting the genuine concern in Rick's expression. "What's the situation?" she asked, already reaching for her jacket. Over the past few months, she had noticed that domestic violence calls were being routed to her more frequently, and she suspected that Captain Rodriguez had quietly spread word about her specialized experience. Woman called in 3 times this week, always hangs up before giving details. Neighbors report screaming and sounds of violence, but by the time units arrive, everything's quiet. Classic pattern of intimidation and control. Rick's analysis showed how much he had learned about the dynamics of abusive relationships since their conversation in the captain's office. As they drove to the scene, Sarah found herself reflecting on how dramatically their working relationship had evolved. Rick no longer questioned her methods or second-guessed her instincts. Instead, he had become an eager student, asking thoughtful questions about victim psychology and learning to recognize the subtle signs of ongoing abuse that less experienced officers often missed. "The key thing to remember," Sarah explained, as they approached the address, "is that leaving an abusive relationship is often the most dangerous time for a victim. The abuser's sense of control is threatened, which can lead to an escalation in violence. Our job isn't just to respond to this incident, it's to help her develop a safety plan for when she's ready to leave." The call turned out to be more complex than either officer had anticipated. The woman, Lisa Chen, was trapped in a cycle of abuse with a partner who had systematically isolated her from friends and family. When Sarah and Rick arrived, they found her with fresh bruises on her arms and a black eye that she initially tried to explain as the result of a fall. Sarah's approach was masterful in its gentleness and understanding. She didn't pressure Lisa to admit to abuse or immediately demand that she leave her dangerous situation. Instead, she provided information about resources, established trust through careful listening, and made it clear that she would be available whenever Lisa was ready to take action. "I know how hard this is," Sarah told Lisa quietly, while Rick kept the abusive partner occupied in another room. "I know it feels impossible to imagine life without him, even when you know staying is dangerous. But I want you to know that there are people who understand what you're going through, and when you're ready, we'll help you find a way out." Lisa looked at Sarah with the desperate eyes of someone who had been drowning for years and suddenly glimpsed a lifeline. "How do you know?" she whispered. "How can you be so sure that things can get better?" Sarah's answer was simple but profound. "Because I've been where you are, and I survived, and now I'm here to help you survive too." The case didn't end that day with an arrest or dramatic rescue. Instead, it ended with Lisa accepting Sarah's card and a promise to call when she felt ready to take the next step toward freedom. 2 weeks later, that call came, and Sarah was there to guide Lisa through the process of leaving safely and connecting with support services. Word of Sarah's exceptional work with domestic violence cases eventually reached the police chief's office. She was asked to develop training materials for other officers, sharing her insights about victim psychology and effective intervention strategies. Her presentations became required training for all new recruits, and experienced officers requested refresher courses to learn her techniques. Rick Thompson found himself in an unexpected role as Sarah's most enthusiastic advocate. He openly discussed how his own prejudices and assumptions had blinded him to the strength and expertise of a colleague who had been right beside him all along. His willingness to admit his mistakes and learn from them became an example for other officers who struggled with similar biases. The thing about real strength, Rick told a group of rookie officers during one of Sarah's training sessions, is that it's not always visible from the outside. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who's been through hell and chose to use that experience to help others, rather than becoming bitter or broken. On a quiet evening 6 months after her revelation, Sarah sat in her apartment looking at commendations and thank you letters from victims she had helped. Her walls were decorated not with photos of awards or achievements, but with pictures of women who had escaped dangerous situations with her assistance. Each photo represented a life saved, a cycle of violence broken, a future reclaimed from the darkness of abuse. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Lisa Chen. 1 year free. Today. Starting nursing school next month. Thank you for showing me that survival is just the beginning. Sarah smiled as she read the message, remembering the terrified woman she had first met and marveling at the transformation that courage and support could create. The gym had become a different place for Sarah now, where once she had trained in solitude, driven by the desperate need to never be vulnerable again. She now found herself mentoring other officers and even some civilian women who had heard about her story through word of mouth. Her workouts had evolved from exercises in survival to celebrations of strength and resilience. Rick Thompson had become an unlikely friend and trusted partner. Their relationship had grown from mutual respect into genuine camaraderie, built on shared experiences and hard-won wisdom. He often said that working with Sarah had made him a better officer and a better person, teaching him to look beyond surface appearances to understand the deeper currents that drove human behavior. You know what I realized? Rick told Sarah one day as they finished their patrol shift. I spent 23 years thinking I was protecting people, but I never really understood what protection meant until I saw how you work with victims. You don't just arrest the bad guys, you rebuild lives. Sarah's impact extended far beyond individual cases. The precinct's approach to domestic violence had been revolutionized by her insights and training programs. Other departments began requesting her expertise, and she found herself traveling to conferences and workshops, sharing her story and teaching others how lived experience could enhance professional effectiveness. Captain Rodriguez had watched Sarah's transformation with deep admiration. In his final evaluation before her promotion to detective, he wrote, "Officer Martinez represents the finest qualities of law enforcement: courage, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Her ability to turn personal trauma into professional strength is extraordinary, and her impact on both victims and fellow officers has been immeasurable." The morning Rick Thompson had smirked at her workout story seemed like a lifetime ago. The woman who had walked into that break room, carrying the weight of secrets and the burden of proving herself worthy, had evolved into someone who understood that true strength wasn't about hiding your scars, it was about transforming them into tools for healing others. As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The scars were still there, hidden beneath her pajamas, but they no longer felt like badges of shame or weakness. They had become part of a larger story of survival, growth, and service that she was proud to share with anyone who needed to hear. Yet her phone rang just as she was turning off the lights. The caller ID showed the precinct number, and Sarah answered expecting another domestic violence case that required her immediate attention. "Martinez, it's dispatch. We've got a situation that specifically requested you." Woman barricaded in her bedroom says she'll only talk to the officer who understands. "Can you respond?" Sarah was already reaching for her uniform before the dispatcher finished speaking. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, she said, knowing that somewhere across the city, another woman was taking the first terrifying step toward freedom, and Sarah would be there to guide her through the darkness toward the light. As she drove through the quiet streets toward another opportunity to serve and protect, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From victim to survivor to protector, she had discovered that the greatest strength came, not from hiding your wounds, but from allowing them to become sources of wisdom and compassion for others who were still fighting their own battles for survival and dignity. The officer who had once been mocked for her dedication to fitness and training had revealed herself to be exactly what she had always claimed to be. Someone whose toughness went far deeper than muscle and technique, whose courage had been forged in the crucible of unimaginable adversity, and whose commitment to protecting others came from an understanding of vulnerability that could only be earned through surviving the unthinkable and choosing to transform pain into purpose.